Hi everyone, Mark and Nicole Conner here, and we're continuing our conversation about the stories we tell ourselves. Today we're going to talk about problem stories. Tell me, Nicole, what is a problem story? Don't use my name.
Well, many of us have experienced recurring stories that focus on a problem. You know, they can be a story of something that we experienced, a trauma, a crisis, a disappointment, something relationally, the list goes on. But the problem story has significant power and is central, often it feels like central to our lives. Problem-saturated stories take up a lot of room. Mm-hmm. They often make somebody feel tired and exhausted. They like the drunken dinner guest that arrives at your dinner party and, they just suck the air out of the room because all the attention is on them. They have a habit of diminishing stories that recognize agency, choice, and response. It can make the storyteller feel lost because the problem is so loud. Mm. And, the values, skills, choices, and responses of the person experiencing the problem can be very quiet when that happens. So our goal in narrative therapy is that the responses is to flip those around and make the values, skills, choices, and responses of a person loud or more visible while diminishing the effect of the problem story. We've got to realize that the skills and knowledges are there because people are not passive recipients of hardship. We are always responding in some way. Mm.
It's like they used to say, it's not always what's happened to us, but the story we're telling about what's happening to us in some ways. Yeah. So can you give us some examples of some common problem stories that, we as humans engage with during our time?
Yeah, look, when I saw that question on the list, I actually thought of Michael. Michael White was the founder of narrative therapy, and he believed that the phenomenon of personal failure or feeling a failure has grown exponentially over recent decades. He said that never before has the sense of being a failure to be an adequate person been so freely available to people. And never before has it been so willingly and routinely dispensed. It's associated with the rise of a distinct modern version of power that establishes an effective system of social control through what can be referred to as normalizing judgment. Normalizing judgment. The messages and power contained in normalizing judgment affects how we feel about ourselves. Normal is a bully. And sometimes can create all sorts of problem stories because we have this idea about what is normal and we don't measure up to that. Listen to all the parrots out there. There's a bunch of parrots flying past right now.
Background noise.
So problem stories are often created in these sort of socio-normative narratives when we feel we don't measure up. Don't measure up to how we think we should be in a relationship, to ideas surrounding success, what success means and goals, the list goes on. And then the effect can be, of feeling a failure can include feelings of anxiety or grief or PTSD or depression, which are also pathologized by modern power. So, problem stories are created in these sort of spaces where we are feeling inadequate as human beings and can present themselves in all different ways.
And I guess comparison's a big part of that, isn't it? Social media, we compare ourselves to others and it kind of destroys any feelings of contentment and we think that other people's lives are normal and therefore we're less than.
Yeah, I like that term that he used of normalizing judgment. It's like we constantly are in judgment of ourselves, perhaps even of others, but mainly of ourselves and how we are not measuring up to these sort of constructed ideas that modern power has pushed towards us.
You sometimes say normal is a construct.
Yeah, it is.
Explain that a bit.
Normal is a construct. Like when we say, well, that's normal. Says who? Says what? Yeah. Some person wrote a book and says, this is how I lived life. Before long, we accept that as normal. 20 ways to, dye your hair green. That now becomes the normal place. And if you don't want to dye your hair green, if you don't have green hair color, if you prefer pink, then a problem story begins to be created because somewhere an idea was constructed around what normalizing green hair means.
Okay.
I just made that up. I was very proud of myself with that green hair.
Very good spontaneity there. So that's fascinating. You said failure is, or a sense of failure is, one of the most common problem stories. Any other examples?
Well, I think that is one of the big stories out of which many, that big failure story
it's like a meta-narrative
has many children and many tribes,
Yeah.
of what it means to be an adequate human, or the ideas of what it means to be an adequate human. Because most of the people that sit in the room with me feel in some ways they're not measuring up, they're falling short of something. When we inquire about that with stories and the meta and personal narratives, it often has to do about messages that were taken on, stories that they are carrying, by which they're measuring themselves, that really in and of itself are a construct. And so we examine those and go, is that still okay with you?
So it could present as anxiety or guilt or
anxiety.
shame or fear, or so it could present as something other than a failure, but it's a result of that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So it has all sorts of effects. Anxiety, for example, has been pathologized and medicated as well. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be, please. I'm not saying it should be. But at the same time, we also need to consider the fact to be human on this rock that we're living is to carry a certain amount of anxiety. Sure. Anxiety has a job to do. Anxiety might be flagging something for us. Anxiety out of control can affect us negatively. All those considerations.
Well, there's some good examples of types of problem stories, many of which we'd be all very familiar with. So what can we do about these problem stories?
Look, I think we've covered a little bit of what I think a narrative approach to problem stories is, which includes externalizing, realizing the person's not the problem is the problem. So we very much objectify the problem story, sometimes in a very humorous way. We might think of it as a person or something, and it has a name. And so, one client referred to a problem eating disorder story that they were no longer okay with as Ed. So we talked about Ed. Yeah, so Ed very much becomes objectified. It's not somewhere innately sitting in the person. It's something that is externalized, and we can look at it, and minimize the judgment and shame that is often associated with problem stories. We then can begin to deconstruct and consider the effect and origin of the story to gain clarity for this client. There was a certain narrative handed down through one of the male family members in regards to what it means to be a female, and the whole, objectifying of a woman's body, and the list goes on. So that clarity was reached. And then we can also begin to talk about the protest, the unique outcomes, alternative stories that speak to somebody's preferred sense of self, the protest that we feel, because we all respond in those situations. Our responses, our protest is often diminished. Somebody might say, that just speaks to taking a position against the problem story.
Okay. Excellent. Well.
And let me just add one more thing, is also to think about, sometimes, what we talked about earlier, this sense of failure. Failure in a sense is protest. You are failing in comparison to something, and often it's a comparison to a modern idea, a constructed idea of power. So, what does that sense of failure, if you turn it on its head into protest, what does it say about you as a person? And how does that protest point to what is really important for you?
So in many ways, these problem stories and the fact that we're engaging with them and trying to do something about them can be reflecting what we really value and what's meaningful for us.
Absolutely. We're really beginning to take a problem story and begin to look at it from all angles, and then to recognize something about ourselves in the stance that we've taken.
Well, that's all for today. We'll continue our conversation about the stories we tell ourselves next time we're together. See you then.
Cheers.